And what we usually have to do is move the formula around a bit. We have to transpose, because we can be given an angle and then we can write, okay, the sine of the angle gives us, I don't know, 0.1 or 0.9 or whatever it is, and we know that that number is equal to the opposite length divided by the hypotenuse length. But then we need to do something with that, because we're either going to know this one, the opposite, or we're going to know the hypotenuse. But then to figure out what the unknown one is, we have to rearrange the equation. So we could say, from transposition, if the sine of something is equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse, then the opposite length is equal to the sine of the angle times the hypotenuse, just from rearranging. So if we want to know what the opposite side length is, and we know the hypotenuse, we know what the angle is, so we can find the sine of it, which will just be a decimal number, say, and multiply it by the hypotenuse length. But if we happen to know the opposite side length instead, and we want to find the hypotenuse, then the hypotenuse is just the opposite length, which we know, divided by the sine of the angle, which we also know. So there's always a way to find the unknown length if we know one of them and the angle in question. So just a quick recap. The three main trig functions, sine, cos and tan. The sine of an angle, and remember trig functions, it's the sine, cos and tan is always of an angle. Anything that follows the sine, cos or tan is always an angle. The sine one is equal to the opposite length over the hypotenuse length. The cos of the angle is equal to the adjacent length divided by the hypotenuse length. And the tan of the angle in question is equal to the opposite length divided by the adjacent length. And that's all very well if you want to find lengths and you know one angle and another length. But a lot of the time we want to find out what the angle between two lengths is. So this is when we start to use inverse trig functions. And it's nothing to be worried about. You just press the shift button before you do sine, cos or tan. And the angle in question for a sine function, the angle theta, is the inverse sine, or also known as arc sine, or sine to the -1, or on a calculator it's shift sine. So theta, the angle, is equal to sine to the -1 of opposite over hypotenuse. So if we know the opposite and we know the hypotenuse, we divide the opposite by the hypotenuse, and then do shift sine or inverse sine of what that number is, and it gives you the angle. And the way that I sort of think about all this inverse stuff, it can be a bit tricky, but if you think that say the cos of an angle, if we look up here, the cos of an angle is equal to the adjacent over the hypotenuse, think of that as the angle in another language, if you like. The cos of an angle is, say, like the angle in French, and we want to work out what the angle is in English. So what we do, we translate it from French to English by doing the inverse of the cos. So the theta, the angle, is the translation, or like, you know, going from cos language back to angle language. So we do this, the inverse function. And similarly for tan. If the tan of an angle is equal to the opposite length divided by the adjacent, then to find the angle itself, we do the inverse of the tan. We translate it back to English, if you like, into angle language. So theta, the angle, is inverse tan of opposite over adjacent. So you still use the same sides. It's just in these top three, we usually know what the angle is, and we know one side, and we find the other side by using these. But down the bottom, we assume that we know both sides in question, and then we divide them and do the inverse function to find the angle. That's all it is. So the sine function, just a quick recap again. If we know this angle and we know the hypotenuse, we can work out the opposite side. If we know the opposite and we don't know the hypotenuse and we know the angle, we can work out what the hypotenuse is with the sine function. Inverse sine finds the angle if we know both sides. Same for cos. You have to know the angle on one side to find the other side. And here we know this angle and we know that side, so we can find that side length. And the inverse function, you have to know both lengths to find the angle. And the same is true of tan. The only difference with sine, tan and cos, we're just talking about different lengths of the triangle, as in different side names. That's all it is. Everything else works the same. It's the same sort of format, if you like.